Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to the Peterson Institute for International Economics virtually for our latest in our Rebuilding the Global Economy series of events. Today, addressing the role of the key congressional committees on trade, foreign affairs, and associated budgeting that have a key role to play in the formation of U.S. foreign economic policy in all dimensions: tax, tariffs, deals, support for the international institutions, and the broader U.S. foreign policy orientation. We're very pleased to have with us today three colleagues of mine, three of the greats of the Peterson Institute, Bergsten, Edwin Truman, and Gary Hufbauer. I will give them an insufficient but longer introduction shortly. We're also delighted to have with us Ms. Lila Foss, known on Twitter as the Trade Lady, I believe, who is Toyota Motor North America's Director for International Public Policy. Toyota, we're proud to disclose and in fact proclaim as a major supporter of the Institute, and has together Toyota and the US and the Institute have seen us through a lot of back and forth in US-Japan relations and foreign economic policy. And we're grateful to Lila for joining us today to give us her perspective as a foreign policy advisor and as a representative of the private sector. First, if I could, just a word about the Rebuilding the Global Economy series. We hope and expect that many of you have already seen some of our efforts, either the memos or the prior rollout events. The purpose of Rebuilding the Global Economy was to mobilize all our senior fellows, our non-resident fellows, and some of our key board members to come together and do practical steps about what a new government in the US, but not just the US, in Europe, in the major international organizations, in the Pacific Rim, could do to rebuild the global economy. Until 10 or 15 years ago, increasing global economic integration and rising living standards went hand in hand across the world. Not every rising living standard was associated with globalization, and not everything on globalization was good. But in the broad, more people came out of poverty and into the middle class around the world through global economic integration. For the last 12 years, say, those two trends have gone into reverse. Both international economic integration has gone into reverse, and economic performance throughout the world has gone into reverse. And these, again, on average over time, are associated. We have seen, particularly in the last 4 years under the economic policies of the Trump administration, but other economic nationalist governments around the world, how much you can make things worse by refusing international cooperation, by neglecting the low-hanging fruit that exists there, and by going counter to basic economic logic. And so we call upon everyone and we try to engage in this discussion of rebuilding the global economy. And we choose the word rebuilding because this isn't about great architectural fantasies, but nor is it just a little bit of remodeling. This is genuinely, we have to rebuild. Just as with ADA, the house has to be accessible to everyone. And so we encourage people from outside the places our fellows come from to engage with us and give their advice and their views. The house has to be big enough for everybody, including some people like China, who are bigger than they used to be. The house has to grow with that. And most of all, the house has to function. The house that we're rebuilding has to be one that lets people make a living without hurting the people around them. This has never been more true than during the pandemic, where vaccine nationalism and other forms of trade interference are costing lives directly. And this will continue to be true on the critical global issues of the day, which are also the critical national issues of the day: climate change, international taxation, vast underemployment, and the ongoing issues of public health. We believe that rebuilding the global economy is the way to address those issues. And so today, we're going to turn again to the importance of Congress and its role, not just in oversight, but as an initiator and director of US foreign policy. And for that, we have together three of the wisest people in the international economics game in the US, as well as one of the wisest people in the practice of international economic policy. So I will introduce them in the order they will speak. First will be Gary Clyde Hufbauer. He was the Institute's first Reginald Jones Senior Fellow, our first endowed chair, from 1992 to January 2018. He since has moved to be semi-retired, but what Gary does in his semi-retired time is more than most of us do full-time. He's previously been the Director of Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, Marcus Wallenberg Professor of International Finance Diplomacy at Georgetown, and is one of the few people in the world who combines vast knowledge of trade law and international tax law with his economic insights. He previously served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Trade and Investment Policy at the U.S. Treasury and worked on, of course, the Tokyo Round. Following him will be Edwin Truman. He's been a non-resident senior fellow at Peterson since July 2013. He joined the Institute in 2001 after a very distinguished career in public service, including as Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Treasury for International Affairs from 1998 to 2001, and as Director of the Division of International Finance in the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve from 1977 to 1998. Ted is something of a legend in central banking circles and continues to be an active voice for the international financial institutions, a topic which he will take up today. Speaking third will be my predecessor as the head of the Institute and the co-founder with Pete Peterson of the Institute, C. Fred Bergsten. He was the founding director from its creation in 1981 through 2012. Fred was the Assistant Secretary of the International Affairs of the U.S. Treasury in 1977 to 81, where he actually acted like what the undersecretaries now do, if not more. And he was also the Assistant for International Economic Affairs in the Nixon White House National Security Council. He was appointed by President Obama to the Advisory Committee on Trade Policy and Negotiations twice, and then reappointed by President Trump in 2018. Fred will be taking us through the big picture of overall foreign policy and where Congress can help lead the public debate. Finally, we will then turn to, as I mentioned, Lila Foss, who is the Director of International Public Policy at Toyota Motor North America. In this role, she deals with global portfolio policies to Toyota's business operations, and she also coordinates with external affairs colleagues around the world. We've known her as a very smart, real-world, non-ideological, practical voice in all discussions of how international investment, international manufacturing are affected in the trade policies of the U.S. Leila has nearly 20 years experience in international trade and investment, government relations. Prior to joining Toyota, she served as an appointee for President Obama at the U.S. Trade and Development Agency as the Director for Export Promotion. So it's a great group. This is entirely on the record. We hope to have people from the Hill and from around the world joining us with questions. If you're a registered Zoom applicant, please use the Q&A function on the Zoom call. But first now, let me turn to Gary Hufbauer.
Thanks very much, Adam. It's a great pleasure to speak to this distinguished group. I'd like to start by recalling Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution, which assigns to Congress the power over foreign commerce and domestic commerce. It's widely recognized by congressional Democrats and Republicans alike that Congress has delegated far too much of this constitutional power to the president to interrupt trade and to initiate agreements. Over the past 100 years, more than a dozen statutes give the president broad authority to impose tariffs and quotas and forbid tech exports and foreign investment. And during the past 4 years, these statutes have been much used and even abused by President Trump. So the first priority for the Congress is to enact an umbrella law that subjects presidential use of these statutes to congressional review and ratification. There are already several bills that have been submitted in the Congress to do just that. The second priority is to renew Trade Promotion Authority, which expires on July 1st, 2021. Trade Promotion Authority enables the president to carry out negotiations. When it's renewed, the Congress should give the president, as it always does, but probably in more detail than previously, instructions on what countries are important to conclude agreements with and what issues should be covered in those agreements. And here I would make just two subsidiary points. One, it will be time to reconsider the Trans-Pacific Partnership. When the United States left the Trans-Pacific Partnership, it was relabeled the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership with 11 members. As President-elect Biden has pointed out, the United States should be in the room where the rules are written for international trade for about half of the world economy. That's what it covers, about half. And it shouldn't be left up to China alone, which has just concluded with many other countries, I believe about 16 other countries, the so-called Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. So the US has to reconsider the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Some changes will need to be done. Congress should have a voice in suggesting what changes are needed to make that agreement acceptable to the United States. The second subsidiary point I would make is that the United States should consider inviting the United Kingdom to join the recently concluded US-Mexico-Canada agreement. That agreement was very popular in Congress, and that's not always true for trade agreements. But that was very popular in Congress. That was negotiated by Ambassador Lighthizer and with a lot of input from the Democrats and Republicans alike in the Congress. And it has detailed provisions on labor, environment, digital trade, other issues that meet US objectives. So it might make a lot of sense just to kind of freshen up these negotiations, which are ongoing with the United Kingdom, and invite them to consider joining this US-Mexico-Canada agreement. After all, the UK has a lot of trade, obviously, with both Canada and Mexico. The third priority that I would highlight is to re-engage with the World Trade Organization. In the past 4 years, the administration has somewhat decoupled from the World Trade Organization. But Congress should specify what reforms it wants in the appellate body. That's a big thorn in the side of Ambassador Lighthizer. What reforms it wants in order to, get back in the game with the World Trade Organization, and I would suggest there are kind of two main reforms. One is timely and brief decisions that are limited to the issues in dispute. The appellate body has been criticized not only by the US, but for wandering off, 800-page decisions, my goodness, and the average time is about 4 years, much too long in commercial negotiations to take 4 years to resolve a dispute. And the second thing, which is which irritates the United States, is the excessive encroachment of the appellate body on the use of countervailing duty and anti-dumping duty determinations. That gets into some technical issues, but I think some reforms could be found there, and the U.S. Could reach an accommodation with other WTO members to revive the appellate body, which now has, which is not functioning. It doesn't have any members to function. The second thing with respect to the World Trade Organization is that Congress, in my view, should emphasize so-called plurilateral agreements, fewer than the 164 members, because it's very hard to get 164 members to agree on anything. And in particular, it's hard to get agreement between the United States and China on really critical issues of the day. But we could get agreement with smaller groups of countries on really important issues like e-commerce, digital flows, electronic commerce, state-owned enterprises, forced technology transfer. We could get agreement with a great many countries in plurilateral groups, not all 164 members. So let me wrap up by noting that on the slide will appear a screen of my main points, my key priorities, and all this will be available online for anybody who cares to download with much more detail than you see on this slide. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gary. Concise, practical, on point. Again, as Gary said, all of the memos and associated links to associated much lengthier background research are available on the Peterson Institute website and on our microsite, Rebuilding the Global Economy. Now let me turn to Ted Truman. Ted? Ted, you need to unmute.
We're learning by doing. Thank you again, Adam. It's a pleasure to participate with you and Lila and my colleagues on this event. Important activity. I address the chairs and ranking members of the relevant committees about U.S. foreign affairs programs generally and U.S. policies towards the international financial institutions specifically. Those institutions, to remind you, are generally the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank Group, and other multilateral development banks. Before turning to some specific recommendations, I have two introductory points. First, foreign affairs activities, programs, and institutions underpin U.S. what's called soft power, that's non-military power. And in my view, as was suggested by, more than suggested by Adam in his introduction, our soft power has been in decline for at least a decade, and the past 4 years have merely accelerated that trend. The IFIs are crucial magnifiers of U.S. policies, addressing the problems and priorities in the global economy and financial system, and we should support them not out of charity, but in our own self-interest. Through them, the United States leverages financing and other forms of support for other countries to address our priorities and mobilize international public opinion. Examples of non-financial support are work at the Bank for International Settlements on financial standards and work at the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, on tax policies. Second, during the coming 117th Congress, U.S. priorities for the IFIs themselves should focus principally on the global coronavirus pandemic and its economic aftermath. That aftermath is likely to stretch for years. Congressional committees, in my view, should view all administration international proposals through the lens of whether they will aid in limiting the spread and reemergence of the pandemic and help countries recover from the economic effects. Because until or unless the rest of the world recovers from the devastating health and economic impacts of the pandemic, our own economy will not prosper. We depend on the physical and economic health of other countries, even as they depend on us. And that is what globalization is about, as Adam mentioned, stressed in its introduction. So in that spirit, I have 5 priorities for the new Congress. First, the Congress should authorize the U.S. Treasury to lend $75 billion, that's a number that I made up partly, to the fund over the next 2 years to provide the fund temporarily with the financial resources to support its members in recovering from the pandemic. The United States, with one exception, during the old crises of the 1970s, has not participated in coordinated lending to the IMF because it's always temporary, and it's a lot of work to get things done for just a temporary solution. But the pandemic demands another exception at $75 billion. That's a number that I picked out of a hat, or somewhat picked out of a hat. It would be larger than that of any other current bilateral lending to the lender to the fund, which is appropriate for the United States. And that authorization could expire on December 31st, 2023. Second, the Congress should authorize the Treasury to make an advance commitment of $4 billion to what's called the 20th replenishment of the World Bank's International Development Association, called IDA 20. IDA focuses on loans and grants to the world's poorest countries, principally in sub-Saharan Africa. And a commitment of $4 billion to IDA 20 would be a 1/3 increase in our commitment to IDA 19. The IDA replenishment is to be put in place by 2023, 2 years from now. And it would, an advance commitment would help to relax the current restraint on spending IDA 19 funds, because it would enable the IDA to be confident that it would have the funds to carry on in the future. Third, the Congress should engage with the new administration to ensure the prompt completion of the 16th General Review of IMF quotas. The target for completing that review is December 2023. The challenge is that the IMF has been marching in place essentially since 2010 on these issues. That was the last time IMF members agreed to any substantive change in adjustment of quotas. IMF quotas should reflect each country's relative size in the world economy, and of course that evolves over time. They determine the maximum amount of financial resources a member is obliged to provide to the fund, and a scale of its power to borrow from the fund. And importantly, it also determines each member's voting share in the fund. The principal issues here are the size of the overall increase in quotas, which should at least replace the existing temporary bilateral lending commitments to the fund, which are about $350 billion out of total resources of $1.2 trillion. And second, the redistribution of quota shares to give greater representation to dynamic emerging market economies, as well as other countries and developing country members who have grown more rapidly in recent years. The new agreement should reduce the combined share of European members, which is 32.4%, and preserve the US share, which is 14 to 17.4%. Over the past 10 years, basically, because we've resisted change, Europeans have been able to hide behind us and resist change themselves. Fourth, and probably provocatively, because we're in the business of being provoking, responsible excess, I think Fred calls it. The Congress should review the decision of the Obama administration not to join the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, or the AIIB. China established this institution in 2015 as a financing vehicle to support infrastructure investment in Asia and beyond. The Obama administration was reasonably wary of that initiative, viewing it as a possible tool for Chinese ambitions. However, we failed to block its creation and appeal, and there are currently 103 countries that are members or prospective members of the AIIB, including all other major advanced countries except Japan. In addition, the bank has a good track record of adhering to international standards in its lending, unlike the China Development Bank and other Chinese policy banks. So US membership in the AIIB would help to limit the use of the bank in the future to achieve its narrow policy objectives, political objectives, and by example, it would help to show an example to other Chinese international lending activities. I should add that the former officials in both administrations of both parties have agreed, in general, there probably are some exceptions, that the Obama decision not to join the AIIB was probably a strategic mistake. Finally, excuse me, it's cold season. I want to add a recommendation that I did not include in my memorandum to the chairs and ranking members of the committees, because it principally involves the administration. Congress should encourage U.S. support for a substantial ad hoc IMF allocation of special drawing rights. SDRs, as they are called, are issued by the fund in proportion to each member's IMF quota. They carry a very low interest rate, currently 0.123%. Emerging market and developing countries receive about 40% of any allocation. And this would help them meet some of their immediate external financial needs. And an allocation, which is easy to do, would be an important signal of cooperation around responding to a common problem in the form of the pandemic. Most other members of the IMF favored the allocation of at least $500 billion in SDRs. However, the United States has blocked a decision to do so because we have a 16.5 voting share, and you need to have 85% agreement to do this. This issue is of interest to the Congress already. The House of Representatives has passed legislation pressing for a change in U.S. policy, and the 117th Congress should press the administration to reverse U.S. policy on this issue. So in summary, Lily's going to put up my summary slide. I have 5 key priorities for the 117th Congress in international financial affairs: lending $75 billion to the fund over the next 2 years, committing to it and in advance to $4 billion in the next replenishment of IDA, prompt completion of the substantive updating of IMF quotas, reconsidering the decision not to join the AIIB, and support for substantial allocation of SDRs. Thank you for your attention. I welcome any comments and questions. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Ted. And again, to pick up on where you picked up on my opening, I pick up on your opening. The U.S. engagement with and support for the international financial institutions isn't an act of charity. It's an act of self-interest for the U.S. as well as having benefits for the rest of the world. Doesn't mean blindly, it means with very specific conditions as you set out, but that is the key. It's not a charitable activity. Not that there's anything wrong with charity, but Congress doesn't seem in a very charitable mood. Speaking of Congress's mood, I'm going to turn now to our founder, Fred Bergsten, who has been tracking congressional moods on China for some time, as well as broader foreign economic policy. Fred, over to you, please.
Thank you, Adam. I want to step back from the specific proposals that both Gary and Ted made, which I agree with, to focus on the broader role of Congress in rebuilding the global economy, the theme of this Institute program. In this context, the Congress obviously includes the committees of primary jurisdiction, the Ways and Means Committee in the House, the Finance Committee in the Senate, but it also includes the Senate Foreign Relations, the House Foreign Affairs Committees, which need to engage actively in this effort and will be the thrust of my comments today. The reason for that is that the recent decline in U.S. clout and standing in the world has a huge economic component. The outgoing administration has fought trade wars with our closest allies, the Europeans, Japan, and Canada. It has declared even more extensive trade war on our adversaries, most notably China, and in fact is heading toward a new Cold War with China, which would not be very much in the U.S. interest. It has denigrated key international institutions, as Gary mentioned, in the context of the World Trade Organization, but also the World Health Organization, the G20, the G7, and others who attempt to foster international economic cooperation. The outgoing administration, and a little bit even before that, the U.S. had made no real effort to mobilize international cooperation to deal with quintessentially global issues. Right now, the pandemic, a quintessentially global health issue, and the worldwide recession or even potential depression that has spawned from that. These are global problems that cry out for global solutions, as Adam said at the outset. Now, all this failure of the U.S. to participate and even lead those efforts is a dramatic and dismal change from the traditional U.S. stance in the world and basic U.S. foreign policy and national security. The U.S. has traditionally supported international economic cooperation, an open world economy. It was a central component of our overall foreign policy since the days of World War II. And U.S. global economic leadership has been an essential element of our overall global stance. So I would submit that it's essential for U.S. foreign policy and indeed national security, as well as our economic interests, which is not the focus today, is in those crucial interests of the United States to rebuild the global economy. That is the central goal of every other country's foreign policy. They all put economics at the center of their foreign policy, so it must be central to ours as well. In addition to getting the specific policies right, along the lines that Gary and Ted have proposed, and I concur with, we must restore domestic political support for international economic cooperation and U.S. global economic leadership. Those have got to be seen as integral elements of overall U.S. foreign policy if we are to rebuild a domestic consensus. Now, the president obviously has to lead that effort, and the president-elect, Joe Biden, has clearly indicated an openness, an interest, a proclivity to move in that direction. But the Congress has got to play a central role, and especially the committees with responsibility for foreign policy and national security have got to be central to that effort. They have three main tasks. First, you have to help restore a positive national narrative about U.S. participation in the world economy, international economic cooperation, U.S. global economic leadership. These are demonstrably good things. Gary and his colleagues did a study just updated a couple of years ago that shows the U.S. economy is $2 trillion per year better off as a result of the global economic integration of the post-war period. It's played an incalculably positive role in our foreign policy, the end of the Cold War, the maintenance of our alliances, the whole superstructure of the U.S. role in the world. But the national narrative about that engagement has deteriorated substantially. The Congress, as well as the administration and the private sector leadership, has got to restore a positive narrative. Secondly, we have to emphasize the importance of all this for U.S. foreign policy. We simply cannot restore our alliances, the bedrock of our international engagement, without a return to economic cooperation. We need a much more effective strategy toward our adversaries, particularly China. The trade war with China has been demonstrably ineffective in getting them to change their economic policies, not to mention their broader stance in the world, sharing economic leadership in a responsible way. Key U.S. global interests have got to be restored. And third, we just need a multilateral and much more sophisticated approach to deal with the unprecedented challenge that China and some others pose to U.S. global economic leadership. The third and final thing is for the foreign affairs committees and the foreign policy community more broadly to push and support the administration to pass the kinds of legislation, resolutions, sentiment building exercises that are necessary to enable policies of this type to go forward. The foreign affairs committees have to engage actively if this is going to become, again, a positive and constructive thrust of U.S. foreign policy. The need is, as Gary said, to revise some of our current laws, to restore a full congressional role in foreign economic policy and U.S. global leadership, avoid the usurpations of power that have occurred in the outgoing administration, and that have made such a wreck of U.S. foreign economic policy in recent years. This is a big agenda. It's going back to basics. It's asking the Congress to partner with the new administration to restore U.S. global economic leadership, U.S. international economic cooperation to a positive and constructive role, both for our foreign policy and for our economy. It's a big agenda, and I hope Congress will get in the middle of that to help restore the global economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fred. We are all here appealing to Congress, which admittedly in today's world is more frustrating than it has been and many times in the past, given partisanship, given some ideas, given the nature of the media and the electoral cycle in today's world. But I think what Fred calls Congress directly to, and what is implicit and explicit in Gary and Ted, is something we all support, that for there to be sustained globalization, global economic integration of the US in the US's own interest, it must have buy-in from Congress, it must have buy-in from the public. And that is not merely a matter of some sales job or some rhetoric. It is a matter of engagement with the facts. It is a matter of engagement with the people. And it is a matter of engagement with the kinds of creative, substantive steps that my three colleagues have spoken about. Now, I'm now going to turn to Lila Foss of Toyota Motor North America, an experienced trade hand from the Obama administration, who can tell us in more real world terms, not that my colleagues weren't real world, but from direct experience of her and her colleagues, how Congress's issues with international economics have shown up on the shop floor and on the store floor. Lila, over to you.
Great, thank you, Adam. And it really is such a joy, both personally and professionally, to join you and Fred, Gary, and Ted today. So thank you for inviting me. And I have to say, you know, I largely agree with all of the brilliant ideas that have been presented. Really wish that they will be heeded. And I just wanted to underscore three of them because of how profound I believe that they are. And, you know, Fred's talk about reestablishing U.S. global economic leadership, and I really love the idea of promoting a positive national narrative, because that is clearly what is lacking. And I think it's very critical for people throughout our country to understand why this role matters, both financially and in terms of security and other elements as well. And then I think Gary really had just such a brilliant idea that the quickest way and the most effective way to reclaim Congress's constitutional authority over trade is to have an umbrella oversight law rather than trying to revise the dozen or so statutes that exist. So I certainly hope that the 117th Congress does that immediately. And then finally, Ted's point about reviving U.S. support for the IFIs and improving coordination of all U.S. foreign assistance, whether bilateral or multilateral, is critical, particularly as we seek to recover from the health and financial impacts of the COVID pandemic. So I don't want to spend too much of our precious time this morning reiterating the specific actions that have already been shared. Rather, I would like to explain why I agree with them. And to do that, I wanted to sort of break it up into three bits, if you will, and beginning with a story, moving on to a study, and suggesting a potential strategy. So first, I'd like to share a story to really illustrate sort of how these ad hoc trade rules impact business. And as you may remember, in June of last year, the administration had threatened to impose tariffs on all imports from Mexico, every single item crossing the southern border. And things could escalate to the point where they actually shut down that southern border. So no matter what you paid, you could not get goods into our country. There was a very short window, just a matter of days, between when the threat was first announced and when the tariffs were supposed to be imposed. And within Toyota, we immediately convened a task force. We pulled key folks from dozens of divisions throughout our company here in North America. And we all flew down to our headquarters in Plano, Texas. This is, of course, back when it was much easier to do things like that. And we put everything else on pause to immediately address this issue and assess the risks and basically figure out a path on how to mitigate them. And a key consideration was our suppliers. Yeah, here in North America for Toyota, when we build vehicles, 70% of our spend is our suppliers. And so I think that's surprising to a lot of people, but they really are on the front lines of a lot of trade issues. And we have about 500 different supplier partners all across the continent. And most of them just do not have the staff to assemble their own task force to address these risks. In fact, 2/3 of supplier jobs, surprisingly, are within small to mid-sized companies that are oftentimes family owned. And they just, quite frankly, don't have the resources to address these unforeseen risks. So it was imperative that we consider their concerns and how we were going to deal with the situation. And so I wanted to share this story because of the fact that all of the disruption that occurred, all of the time and money and energy and resources that went into it were for a threat of tariffs. Thankfully, they were never actually imposed. But all of that time, money, resources, and effort that went into addressing them is dead weight loss for our company. You know, it's time and resource and effort that we can't put into our priorities, such as making vehicles smarter, safer, and more efficient. And if you were to multiply this dead weight loss across all the companies in our country that have to do it every single time a threat is addressed. And this is, again, managing the threats. You haven't even gotten to how we've dealt with something like the actual imposition of tariffs, such as the 232 steel and aluminum tariffs. And so, secondly, I wanted to touch upon the countless and really well done studies that have been conducted over the past couple of years, determining the economic impacts of the tariffs that we've seen under sections 232 and 301. And I think the analysis clearly reveals that it is indeed American companies and American consumers who pay these tariffs. It is not foreign companies, and it certainly is not foreign governments that pay them. And the true cost of tariffs, as we know, goes beyond the direct price increase of the goods that are slapped with these duties. You know, there are the efficiency costs, which I just described in my story, but there's also what I like to think of as the uncertainty costs. And I think that is something that needs more analysis. And so when tariffs are introduced unexpectedly and imposed rapidly, it's impossible for companies to calculate their size, their scope, or their duration. How long are we going to have to manage these additional expenditures? Likewise, retaliatory tariffs, which U.S. companies will undoubtedly face in response to these U.S. tariffs, are also present unknown size, scope, and duration. And so this tremendously increases uncertainty costs for companies. And as any company will tell you, they need uncertainty because we face so many unknowns, whether it's natural disasters, whether it's pandemics, or other things, that we at least need to know that the rules that were in place when we made some significant investment decisions remain in place throughout the life cycle of those investments. And so when you have these tariffs, it's hard to calculate the actual cost of the inputs that you need for production. And I just want to highlight, lest anybody forgets, that when tariffs are introduced, it not only increases the price of inputs that you import, it also increases the price of domestically produced goods. That is why they are sort of a slippery slope when they're introduced. And if you consider that the average car has about 25,000 parts, that is a lot of inputs that you need to calculate costs for. And what happens when you can't accurately price them? Or when you're worried that you can't even obtain them? I mean, how does that impact your ability to put these inputs into the hands of your highly skilled American workers in order to make your products? And speaking of products, what do these cost increases of the inputs mean for the price of your finished product? Not only here in the US, and will you still be cost competitive, but overseas markets. And so for Toyota, you know, people may be surprised to learn that our US built vehicles are exported to 30 countries, you know, and I think that shocks a lot of people. And when you think of all these cost increases, will our exports still remain cost competitive in those foreign markets? And that is a really important consideration because, simply put, our foreign buyers support our American workers. And so in real world terms, the uncertainty costs that are presented by tariffs, or the threat of tariffs, affect business decisions, including investment decisions and hiring decisions. And of course, this is a significant drag on economic activity. And so while there have been several studies analyzing the direct cost of tariffs, I would urge Congress to study the impact of these uncertainty costs that they inflict. You know, what is the impact of the investments that do not get made, the job offers that are not extended, and the US exports that do not reach their markets? And so finally, I wanted to end with a discussion on the importance of strategy. And I think, you know, the arbitrary use of tariffs as a way to protect national security really sets a bad example, and one that could tempt our trade partners to single out our most important export sectors, such as agriculture, and target it for reciprocal treatment. And whereas national security is the utmost important thing for any country, and everyone, of course, fully supports that, it has to be clear that that is actually the goal of any action, and it's not done for other means. And the other sort of challenge with this is that it really contradicts the advice that we give to countries that receive U.S. foreign aid. In fact, many eligibility requirements for U.S. foreign assistance state that markets have to implement market-oriented reforms and certainly avoid market distorting behavior. And so we're not really practicing what we preach on that front. And as Adam mentioned, before joining Toyota, I had the honor of serving as an appointee for President Obama at USTDA. And I think that agency really provides an excellent example of how not only to coordinate foreign assistance, but to leverage it to promote U.S. foreign policy goals, advance economic development overseas, and even support U.S. jobs through the export of U.S. goods and technology. And so in the TDA's example is they fund the very early stages of project planning to assess whether there's a there, whether it's feasible to build a large scale infrastructure project. And this is critical because that seed funding is what's the hardest thing for project developers to get. I mean, once they have a beautiful document that lays out sort of the cost analysis and benefits of building infrastructure, it's easy to gather financing. But until then, it's challenging. And I think this level of coordination, because TDA funds the feasibility and the new OPEC, the US, I think International Development Finance Organization, or XM, have the opportunity to come in and fund it. And so that's something that should be replicated at the multilateral level. But overall, U.S. strategy must address how we can help less developed countries recover from the pandemic. The global economy will not do well if we have a two-track recovery. And we saw that happen in the wake of the 2018 through 10 financial crisis, where we had a two-track recovery just within the G20, and we want to avoid that. So in conclusion, I just wanted to, again, emphasize my support for the wonderful recommendations that have been made, and also just emphasize the fact that America does not lead and certainly does not grow when we restrict capital, talent, or innovation. And we lead and we grow when we attract them. And so I encourage congressional leaders to focus on developing strategies that do just that. Thank you.
Thank you, Lila. We've got a bunch of questions, including from some very distinguished folks. So I'm going to try to gather them. The first, as a public service announcement, comes from Andy Olson, who is the Deputy Staff Director of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He wants to draw our attention to some documents that the committee has put out, including one released just yesterday by the Senate Foreign Relations Committee majority, a report on U.S. and Europe, a concrete agenda for transatlantic cooperation on China. And thank you for bringing that to our attention, Andy, and we will all certainly read it. Going next, let me start with our friend Kathleen Stevenson, who has a question for Gary Hufbauer. Would the UK joining Mexico, US, Canada trade agreement wouldn't it give a negative signal to the EU just at the time when the US ought to rebuild transatlantic relations?
Well, that's a good point, and certainly the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement would have to be renamed, as Steve Charnham had sent me a note to that effect. I don't know if it'd be so negative with the EU. I would dearly love to see U.S.-EU relations being restored, but I think there are a lot of individual issues that have to be waded through before that happens, and I believe that's it will take at least 18 to 24 months to do, so I see the UK as a bit quicker.
Thank you for the tight answer, Gary. I am just typing because some people want to raise their hand, which we can do only with a smaller group. With this large group, if you have a question, please put it on the Q&A function. Now a question for Fred, from Martin Weiss. Responding to Fred's comment about improved coordination, should Congress revisit the 1966 NAC decision and give state and possibly other agencies more statutory authority over U.S. participation at the IFEs as originally intended when they were established? And
well,
Ted,
as I said,
they also want to come in on that.
Yeah, the U.S. participation in the IFEs and foreign economic policy more broadly is a quintessentially foreign policy as well as economic issue. In the early post-war period, back to when I was in government, in fact, most U.S. foreign economic policy was determined by the foreign policy community. That became unviable as globalization proceeded. U.S. economy became more integrated in the world. But there needs to be a more effective balancing between the domestic economic side and the foreign policy side in the creation of foreign economic policy. Revisiting that old statute might be one way to do it, but I think the more effective way is simply for an administration, like the incoming Biden administration, to make sure that its foreign policy people work with its economic policy people in forging foreign economic policy. That has certainly worked in previous administrations quite well, and it can be done again.
Thank you. Ted, is there anything you want to ask at that, since you were present at that time as well?
And in the Clinton administration, I think it is a crucial, you have to have someone in charge. On the other hand, there has to be consultation. And the best way to do that, that's part of the role of the White House, if you want to put it that way. So interagency groups are the way to organize this. And certainly in my days in the Clinton administration, that was how we did things. And I think in general, with one or two exceptions, there was a buy-in across the whole community about what we were doing and understanding of why we're doing it. And I think that's a better way, to do it. You have to have someone that carries the torch in the Treasury on most of these issues is probably the reasonable person, place to do it.
Thank you, Ted. And I appreciate my colleagues' concise replies, because these are very good questions and we want to get to as many as possible. A question for Lila from Mara Lee. How do you think USMCA implementation and enforcement will affect the auto industry over the next 2 years? Has USTR already approved Toyota's alternate staging regime? Are you concerned that the rapid response mechanism will increase costs for your company? And if so, how are you working with Mexican suppliers to mitigate that risk?
Ross, you clearly know the deal very well. I think, USMCA, of course, became the law of the land on July 1, and it is, in terms of the auto chapter, significantly requires more certification requirements from automakers and suppliers. And so that process it's going to see how that works out, because we're in this sort of, not necessarily grace period, but in this period where we've got a little bit of leeway to provide some of the documentation from Customs and Border Protection, which will end the end of this calendar year. And so I think that it'll be interesting to see how that goes from there. We fortunately are in a very good position. We have such a robust presence here in the US with 10 factories across the country, and source a lot of our core parts, the engines, transmissions, as well as steel and aluminum from right here. So fortunately, we're in a very strong position. That I can't speak on behalf of other automakers, but I do think there is concern about the implementation, but that's not unusual. That's true with any trade agreement. If we were to go back in time to when NAFTA became the law of the land, there was also this sort of bumpy ride to figure out the compliance and implementation issues and how to certify. And so I think for the labor, you're probably talking about the rapid response mechanism for labor. Those details are still being ironed out. So I think people are watching that closely. And as far as I know, the ASRs are still under review by USTR and their counterpart within Canada and Mexico.
Just a couple clarifications, if I could ask for Lila, since not all of us are as deep into it as either you or Mara, who asked the question. First, so is a summary of your statement that this particular aspect of USMCA implementation is not unusual. This is just part of doing business, and your outlook is reasonably calm?
Yes, and I think there's some things that still need to be finalized. So I think a lot of companies are eager to see how the rules look once the I's are dotted and T's are crossed. But I also think, CBP has been great. They set up a USMCA center for questions. I think there's a lot of dialogue going on. And ASR, sorry to use inside baseball, but that's an alternate staging regime, which was a provision that was allowable for auto companies who, if they wanted to, request more time to meet some of the rules for a certain amount of their production.
And could you just give us literally 2 sentences on what it means for labor when you talk about the rapid response function.
Yeah, so this was a provision that before USMC would be ratified, that Democrats were very eager to get in place, and that allows people to basically file a complaint or anything that they determine violates labor rights. And so how to do that is what's being ironed out. There's supposed to be a website in which you can do that. And, you know, it's not up and running yet, but what does it look like? What kind of evidence is required? Is evidence required? What is the sort of response that companies have? Particularly, I think suppliers is the main concern to sort of assess that. That's what's all kind of up in the air still.
Thank you. Andy Olson from Senate Foreign Relations is back with a question specifically for Gary. On Section 301, many have pointed out that there are gaps in the Uruguay agreements with respect to services and intellectual property. Admittedly, those were first-time agreements, and they were probably not as comprehensive as the U.S. would have liked. When is it appropriate to use 301 outside of the WTO dispute settlement mechanisms with respect to protecting U.S. services and IP interests?
Well, another great question. The question is quite right that the Uruguay round has a framework for services, but very little content. And on IP, there are a lot of exceptions for developing countries on IP. Yes, I think in those two areas, if there are unreasonable, unfair, unjustified, what we regard as unjustified measures, it's appropriate, but to use 301, but it should be very targeted. And what's happened in the Trump administration, it was used as just as a blunderbuss against China. So it was far removed from what I think was the original intent back in 1973 of the Section 301 statute. But yes, IP and services are fair game.
Thank you, Gary. And now we've got one overall question from Michael Michaud that I'm going to pose to my 3 economist colleagues and spare Lila on this final go round. Let's have Ted, Gary, and Fred in that order reply. Despite tariffs imposed by the US under the Trump administration, the trade deficit is not falling as President Trump promised it would. Do you think controlling the deficit, by which I assume either trade or current account deficit, will be a future priority? Should it be a future priority? Either way, how should Congress and the new administration think about it and approach it? And this is obviously something my colleagues and I at the Peterson Institute have been wrestling with for a long time, and we have differing views. So Ted, starting with you, please.
Now, my view is basically the trade deficit is a function of macroeconomic policy, and we get the macroeconomic policy right, and we can keep reasonably close to full employment. The trade deficit will take care of itself, and one should not worry about it, with the exception of abrupt changes where better, to use the dirty word, adjustment assistance or ways of helping the beat losers is important.
Thank you, Ted. That was really tight and clear. Gary?
Well, I agree with Ted, 80%. 20% difference is that when we are in a depressed situation, and by that I mean unemployment, let's say 7% or above, it's obviously the trade deficit becomes a political issue. It goes out of the economic realm into the political realm, and people say, well, if we didn't have this trade deficit, we would have, instead of 7%, 8% unemployment, we'd only have 6% or 5% unemployment. That's the kind of political arithmetic that appeals to a lot of people. So I would say when, as Ted said, when you get the macroeconomic situation right, you get unemployment down to 4%, the trade deficit is really no issue. When it's way high, it's inescapable that it becomes a political issue.
Of course, Gary, we have to point out that the trade deficit was picked up as a political issue by President Trump during a period when unemployment was reaching post-war lows.
Yes,
So,
but that was ridiculous.
yeah, no, that's fine. I just wanted
It was just a ridiculous
that's
time to
all I
worry
wanted.
about the trade deficit. And of course, as Ted has rightly said, you can't do anything about the trade deficit through tariffs. You'd have to use macro policy, but it will be a political issue.
Thank you very much, Gary. Fred?
I would underline two words in the question: controlling the deficit, not eliminating it. Not necessary to eliminate the current account deficit. It is necessary to keep it down to a dull roar. It's now edging up a little bit high, 3.5% of GDP. Keeping it down to somewhere around 2 is, I think, desirable, because then our net foreign debt does not grow, and that's clearly controllable. The other key word is a future priority. I would not give it priority now. We're in the midst of COVID. We're in the midst of a global recession and depression caused by COVID. Obviously, there are much more urgent things to go after now than the trade deficit. It was a misplaced priority even during the last administration. But over the longer term, for the future, it is necessary, as I say, to hold it down to a dull roar. And in that sense, it should be on the priority list. It should be emphasized that one cannot, repeat, cannot reduce the trade deficit through import barriers and trade policy measures. That is demonstrably ineffective. The last 4 years have demonstrated it once again. One has to deal with it in a more macroeconomic sense, deal with exchange rates and the like, but that would be the agenda for dealing with it over time to bring it under control.
Wow. My three distinguished colleagues have mellowed and converged through the years. Usually have slightly bigger differences. So on that happy note, and hoping we can contribute to a similar mellowing and convergence in Congress on issues of U.S. foreign economic policy, and more seriously, less facetiously, hoping that those of you listening help us take the message to Congress that it should reassert more of its authority in the areas of trade, in the areas of international financial oversight. It should engage with the global economy in the self-interest of the U.S., and there are practical steps it can take and encourage to make that more sustainable politically in the U.S. to all our benefit. Please join me in virtually thanking, as I genuinely thank, Lila Foss of Toyota North America, Ted Truman, Gary Hufbauer, and Fred Bergsten of the Peterson Institute for International Economics. All these materials and the video will be available on our website. We encourage you to join us for more of the Rebuilding the Global Economy series. Thank you.